in the cold hours before dawn on March 15, 1623. Somewhere deep within the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace, a sound pierced the silence that had nothing to do with celebration. It was a scream raw and desperate rising from the throat of a 15-year-old girl who had just discovered that being born a princess in the Ottoman Empire offered no protection from the nightmare waiting beyond her wedding chamber door. Her name was Fatima Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, and what happened to her that night was whispered about for generations but never recorded in the official chronicles. Some horrors are too deliberate, too systematic, to ever be written in imperial histories. The Ottoman court kept immaculate records of military victories, architectural achievements, and diplomatic triumphs. But the preparation rituals that broke the spirits of royal daughters before their marriages remained carefully unacknowledged, existing only in the coded language of palace servants and the traumatized silence of the women who survived them. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just vast, it was totalitarian for over 600 years, from its founding in 1299 until its dissolution in 1922. It controlled territories spanning 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the Balkans to North Africa. When Mehmed the Conqueror seized Constantinople in 1453, he didn't merely capture a city, he redrew the map of human civilization, and declared that the Ottoman approach to power, absolute, methodical, and uncompromising, would define the future. At the heart of this empire stood Topkapi Palace, a sprawling complex of courtyards and chambers where the Sultan's word was law and every ritual, no matter how private, served the empire's larger purposes. Within these walls existed the imperial harem, home to over 800 women living under conditions of extraordinary luxury and equally extraordinary control. Most were slaves, Christian girls captured in wars or purchased in markets, torn from their families and trained in the arts of music, poetry, and submission. They learned to walk with measured steps, to speak in careful phrases, to understand that their entire existence depended on catching the Sultan's attention and using that brief moment of favor to build something resembling security in a world designed to keep them powerless. But there was another class of women in the harem, women who couldn't hope to rise because they had been born at the summit, the Sultan's daughters. Girls like Fatima, who discovered that imperial blood was both blessing and curse. That being a princess meant being the most valuable piece on the political chessboard and therefore the most thoroughly controlled. While the Sultan's concubines could sometimes maneuver, could use intelligence and charm to gain influence, could even rise to become queens who wielded real power, the Sultan's daughters had no such opportunities. Their marriages were decided before they learned to read. Their futures were determined not by their talents or desires but by what alliances their bodies could secure for the empire. This was the era of the Sultanate of women, spanning from 1533 to 1656, when figures like Harem Sultan and Kosum Sultan ruled from behind veiled doors with more authority than most viziers. But that power, impressive as it was, remained the privilege of women who had entered the palace as slaves. The Sultan's daughters, born to privilege, were paradoxically more constrained than the women their fathers had purchased. Fatima Sultan was born in 1606 to Sultan Ahmed I and the formidable Kosum Sultan, who would become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. From her earliest childhood, Fatima exhibited the kind of brilliance that made scholars take notice. She mastered 4 languages before most children learned basic reading. She studied astronomy, mapping the movements of stars with precision that impressed the court's mathematicians. She learned calligraphy until her hand could reproduce verses with breathtaking beauty. She debated Islamic law with imams and discussed philosophy with visiting scholars who were astonished that a girl so young could grasp concepts most adults found challenging. Ottoman chroniclers called her a jewel of the dynasty, comparing her to legendary queens of the past. In another life, in another place, Fatima Sultan might have been remembered as one of the great intellectuals of her age, but she had been born into a world where a woman's intelligence was only valuable if it could be controlled and ultimately suppressed in service of imperial politics. When Fatima reached 15, her marriage was arranged to Kara Mustafa Pasha, a military commander 20 years her senior who had distinguished himself in various campaigns. For him, this union represented the pinnacle of ambition, a connection to the imperial bloodline that would secure his position and elevate his family. For Fatima, it represented something she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but already deeply feared. The whispers among the palace women spoke of preparation rituals, of training that went far beyond learning household management or religious duties. They spoke of something called the Turbi Mubarak, the blessed training. Though the name itself was a careful lie designed to make acceptable what was actually a systematic process of psychological destruction. Not even her mother, Kosum Sultan, who wielded enormous influence and had survived decades of palace intrigue, could protect Fatima from what tradition demanded. The empire's need superseded maternal love, and the empire needed Fatima to be broken before she could be given away. The preparation began months before the wedding date. Fatima was removed from her chambers and placed under the supervision of Gulnar Hatun, an elderly woman whose face showed no warmth, whose voice carried no sympathy. The training started with seemingly innocuous lessons in etiquette and comportment. Fatima learned to bow at precise angles, neither too shallow nor too deep. She learned to walk with measured steps, never hurried, never casual. She learned a vocabulary carefully limited to expressions of gratitude, apology, and acceptance. But as the weeks progressed, the training became darker and more invasive. Accounts passed down through generations of palace women speak of rehearsals conducted in underground chambers, of wax figures crafted by Venetian artisans, of lessons no adolescent should ever receive. Whether these specific details are accurate or represent the traumatized memories of witnesses trying to describe the indescribable, the effect was unmistakable. Fatima was being systematically stripped of her identity, her intelligence deliberately crushed, her will methodically broken. The final weeks brought new humiliations designed to erase any remaining sense of self-worth. Fatima was ordered to serve her father's concubines, the slave women who had once bowed to her. She washed their feet, dressed their hair, prepared them for their evenings with the sultan. Each act was carefully calculated to remind her that, in the hierarchy of the harem, even her father's mistresses now stood above her. When she wept during these services, the tears were noted in records as signs of proper humility being achieved. 7 days before the wedding, Fatima was transferred to the Helva Pavilion, a beautiful prison where every aspect of her existence came under absolute control. Her diet consisted of pomegranates, honey, milk, and spiced elixirs that some claimed contained substances meant to induce docility. She was bathed in oils infused with poppy and valerian, plant extracts known for their calming properties. The walls were covered with tapestries depicting obedient wives celebrated for their submission, and mirrors were positioned so she could never escape her own reflection. A Sufi meditation technique called maraka, self-observation, twisted into a weapon of control. By the time the wedding day arrived, the girl who had once debated scholars and charted the movements of stars had been reduced to silence. She no longer spoke, not from fear alone but because something essential had been systematically destroyed inside her. The wedding celebration on March 15, 1623, was everything the Ottoman Empire did best. Overwhelming spectacle designed to remind everyone watching of imperial power and divine favor. The streets of Istanbul filled with processions of cavalry and musicians playing instruments from every corner of the empire. War drums thundered alongside the strings of ouds, while dancers from Persia and Andalusia performed in the palace courtyards. Incense thick enough to taste hung in the air, mixing with the smells of roasting meat and honeyed pastries. The janissaries, the sultan's elite forces, displayed their martial discipline while nobles competed to present the most extravagant gifts. Chroniclers recorded every detail for posterity, describing a celebration worthy of the dynasty's greatness. What they did not record were the observations of palace physicians, who noted that Princess Fatima exhibited signs of what they called virginal melancholy, a diagnosis that revealed more about their willful blindness than about her actual condition. She drank almost nothing despite the spring heat. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembled, and her pulse was erratic. In modern terms, we would recognize severe panic attacks and acute trauma response. In 1623, these symptoms were dismissed as natural wedding nerves, as if what Fatima was experiencing bore any resemblance to normal anxiety. If you've stayed with us this far, if you're beginning to understand that the golden magnificence of the Ottoman court concealed machinery designed to break human spirits, then you're exactly who we create this content for. We're committed to uncovering the voices that were deliberately silenced, to examining the systems that turned suffering into tradition, to remembering the real people behind the imperial chronicles. These weren't just historical curiosities, they were human beings whose pain deserves to be acknowledged. If these stories matter to you, if you believe we have an obligation to remember what empires preferred to forget, please subscribe, because there are hundreds more stories waiting to be told, and every one of them challenges us to think differently about what we celebrate as history. When the feasting ended and the guests departed, Fatima was led to the bridal pavilion, an octagonal structure built in the palace gardens specifically for this purpose. Officially, it symbolized purity and sacred union. In reality, it was a stage set designed for the final act of her transformation from person to property. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting military conquests, a not-so-subtle reminder that this marriage was itself a form of conquest, that Fatima's body had become territory to be claimed in service of imperial politics. She was bathed once more in rosewater and sandalwood, her skin anointed with perfumed oils until she gleamed like an object in a treasury. The wedding gown they dressed her in was so heavy with pearls and embroidered gold that it seemed less like clothing and more like chains. Some accounts suggest that her final cup of ceremonial wine contained more than the traditional spices, that drops of opium had been added to blur consciousness and prevent resistance. Whether this specific detail is accurate or represents the traumatized memories of attendants trying to explain what they witnessed, it reveals something important about the system itself. Even Fatima's consciousness, her final refuge, was considered something to be controlled. Kara Mustafa Pasha had been kept separate throughout the day, receiving his own preparations from male elders who instructed him in the gestures expected of a husband claiming his imperial bride. Some accounts suggest he was told to approach the Union as he would a military campaign, with dominance and authority. Whether this is true or exaggerated, the very existence of such rumors reveals how thoroughly intertwined politics and intimacy had become in the Ottoman court. That marriage wasn't personal, it was dynastic. Fatima's body wasn't hers, it belonged to the empire's future. Last, she was led into the consummation chamber while female attendants positioned themselves outside the door, not to give privacy but to ensure compliance, to listen and verify that the union was completed. In Ottoman tradition, the consummation wasn't merely a private act but a political event requiring witnesses who could confirm the marriage's validity. What happened in that chamber remains known only to those who were present, but the aftermath tells its own story. When morning came, Fatima was silent. Not the peaceful silence of contentment but the hollow silence of something broken beyond repair. Palace physicians were summoned within days, recording symptoms we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. She wouldn't speak, sometimes for days at a time. She couldn't tolerate the presence of men, even trusted eunuchs who had known her since childhood. She suffered sudden violent fits of weeping that came without warning and ended just as abruptly. She stopped eating unless forced. The remedies attempted were many: herbal infusions meant to calm the spirit, music therapy performed by the palace's finest musicians, even Sufi meditation techniques designed to restore inner peace. Nothing worked. The brilliant young woman who had mastered 4 languages and debated theology with scholars was gone, replaced by a ghost who moved through the palace performing the motions of life without actually living. The marriage continued because it had to. Children were born, fulfilling the dynastic requirements. Ceremonies were held, maintaining appearances. But in private, the truth was impossible to ignore. Later memoirs from courtiers suggest that even Kara Mustafa Pasha began avoiding his wife, retreating into military campaigns and opium, haunted by the knowledge that his wedding night had destroyed the woman he had married. He fulfilled his public duties, appearing at imperial functions with Fatima silent at his side, a beautifully dressed shadow who never smiled, never laughed, never showed any sign of the person she had once been. The years accumulated like sediment, each one burying her former self a little deeper. Palace physicians continued to record her symptoms with clinical detachment: fevers, fainting spells, racing pulse, all worsening each year around the anniversary of her marriage. Her voice, when she used it at all, became barely audible. Books lay unopened, musical instruments gathered dust. The courtyard where she had once studied the stars remained unvisited. Fatima Sultan lived for nearly 30 more years after her wedding night, but those who had known her as a child insisted that she had actually died in 1623. Everything that came after was just her body forgetting to stop. When she finally passed away in 1652, the official cause was listed as brain fever, a conveniently vague diagnosis that explained nothing while absolving everyone. Palace records noted the date of her death with bureaucratic efficiency and moved on to other matters. But those who had witnessed her decline understood something the official chronicles would never acknowledge. Fatima hadn't died from fever. She had died from a wedding night that destroyed her capacity to live, and she had spent 3 decades trapped in the aftermath. The tragedy wasn't unique. Scattered through Ottoman archives are traces of other princesses whose lives followed similar patterns, names that appear briefly in marriage records and then vanish behind euphemisms like illness, withdrawal, or melancholy. Some historians suspect cases of suicide carefully disguised as natural deaths. Others point to records that simply end, princesses who disappeared from documentation entirely as if they had never existed. There are whispered accounts of princesses who embroidered secret messages into their garments, coded communications to sisters or friends, desperate attempts to be heard by someone who might understand. There are stories of women who petitioned for divorce, an extraordinarily rare and daring act that almost never succeeded, because granting such requests would acknowledge that something had gone wrong, that the system itself was flawed. There are even rumors of princesses who faked their own deaths to escape being married off a second time after being widowed. Whether these specific stories are accurate or represent the traumatized collective memory of palace women trying to preserve some record of resistance, they reveal an important truth. The golden splendor celebrated in imperial chronicles concealed a machinery of suffering that operated with bureaucratic efficiency, turning the daughters of sultans into political instruments while systematically destroying anything that made them human. The Ottoman Empire built architectural wonders that still stand today, monuments to engineering genius and artistic vision that draw millions of visitors who marvel at the sophistication of Islamic civilization. The domes and minarets, the intricate tilework and soaring arches, all of it is genuinely magnificent and genuinely deserving of admiration. But empires are not built on architecture alone. They are built on control, on the systematic breaking of wills, on the transformation of human beings into instruments of policy. And the Ottoman approach to controlling its royal daughters reveals something uncomfortable about how power actually functions. This wasn't random cruelty or individual sadism. It was systemic, carefully designed, passed down through generations as tradition. The preparation rituals that destroyed Fatima weren't improvised. They were refined over centuries, perfected into a science of submission. The wedding night that broke her wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed, and this pattern wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Every empire, from ancient Rome to imperial China, from the Mughals to the European monarchies, developed similar mechanisms for controlling royal women. The specifics varied, but the principle remained constant. Women of royal blood were too valuable as political assets to be allowed personal autonomy, too important as diplomatic tools to be permitted their own desires, too useful as symbols to be acknowledged as individuals with rights. Their bodies became territory to be negotiated, their marriages became treaties, and their suffering became the foundation upon which dynastic stability was built. The tragedy of Fatima Sultan forces us to confront a question we'd rather avoid. When we celebrate the achievements of great empires, when we admire their art and architecture, when we study their political systems and military victories, whose suffering are we choosing not to see? How many palaces were built on the broken spirits of women whose names we'll never know? How many monuments to imperial glory rest on foundations of systematic trauma? The mirrors that surrounded Fatima in the Helva Pavilion, turning self-observation into a prison, remain a powerful metaphor. We live surrounded by mirrors of our own, historical narratives that reflect back only what we're comfortable seeing, stories that celebrate power while carefully editing out the cost. But just as those mirrors couldn't protect Fatima from what was coming, our selective historical memory can't erase the reality of what empires did to survive. The voices were silenced, but the silence itself speaks volumes. The records were destroyed, but their absence tells its own story. The pain was never officially acknowledged, but it echoes through centuries in the coded whispers of those who witnessed it and refused to let it be completely forgotten. So we ask you now, as you sit with the weight of Fatima's story, what responsibility do we have to remember the women whose suffering was considered necessary for the functioning of empires? How do we honor the voices that were deliberately erased without turning their trauma into entertainment? And what does it mean that we can visit Topkapi Palace today, walk through its magnificent courtyards, admire its stunning architecture without ever being told about the underground chambers where princesses learned submission, or the pavilions where their spirits were systematically broken? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter. The more we refuse to look away from the uncomfortable truths behind historical monuments, the harder it becomes to build new systems of power on similar foundations of hidden suffering.